This is Trump on Earth. I'm Julie Grant. As Election Day nears, a majority of registered voters in the United States say climate change will be an important issue in making their choice for president. That, according to a Pew Research Center survey conducted over the summer. But a possibly surprising number of people who say they care about climate change and the environment don't actually cast ballots. That's where the Environmental Voter Project comes in. For the past 4 years, the nonpartisan organization has been building what it calls an army of environmental supervoters. Its goal is not to get people to care about the environment more or to change minds about climate change. It's to get already registered environmental voters to vote in the presidential election and others. And it's done by precisely targeting these voters. Nathaniel Stinnett is founder of the Environmental Voter Project.
If you haven't been paying attention for the last 4 years, you still think that climate or the environment is a second or third tier issue. And actually, it's right up near the top now. And when you have 12% of voters not just caring about an issue, but listing it as their number one priority, that can really have a political and policymaking impact.
And as I mentioned, the Pew Research Center, their survey, which was done in late July, early August, found 42% of voters saying climate change will be a very important issue in making their decision about who to vote for in the presidential election. And then another 26% saying it would be somewhat important. So more than half saying climate change is at least a somewhat important issue to them. So what's happening?
Two things. One, certainly more and more people are listing climate and environmental issues as their top priority, and more people are listing it, even if it's not their top priority, as one of their top priorities. And that's very good news. However, to get at the work that we do at the Environmental Voter Project, we live in a political system where it's not that important if a lot of Americans care about something. Rather, it's important if a lot of voters care about something. And this is, I know it sounds cynical, but it's public record whether you vote or not, Julie. It's public record. And so for obvious reasons, politicians care about the opinions of voters much more than non-voters. And so what we focus on at the Environmental Voter Project is not trying to persuade people to change their minds and care more about climate or the environment. Instead, we focus solely on changing their behavior. We find people who already care deeply about climate or the environment, and they just aren't voting, and we try to nudge them into becoming better voters. Because we already know that the number of environmentalists is growing, but what's ultimately important is to get them to show up on Election Day.
So how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, so it's a 3-step process. The first is we use data analytics and predictive modeling. So these huge polls, we'll poll 10, 15,000 people per state. That helps us not only identify who the environmentalists are, but then use that information and extrapolate out to find other people like them who care deeply about the environment. And then we use public voting records to isolate the ones who aren't voting. So that's our first step, find the non-voting environmentalists. Then the second step is, once we've identified these people, we don't need to waste any time on the hard, expensive stuff of politics, which is changing minds and changing opinions. We can just go right to leveraging the latest behavioral science to turn them into better voters. And we can be completely agnostic with our messaging. I mean, we could talk about chocolate chip cookies at that point if it was the best way to get them to vote. And then the third step is, when you're trying to change someone's behavior, you can't just talk to them every 2 or 4 years when there's a big federal election going on. And so what we take very seriously is we go into a state, and whenever there's an election, local, state, federal, primary, general, special, we use that as a behavioral intervention opportunity to truly change these people's voting habits.
Before the 2018 election, you talked about creating what you called an army of environmental supervoters to rival the National Rifle Association. So how are you doing? I mean, the 2018 obviously was not a presidential year, but how have you been doing in pursuit of that goal?
So we've been doing great. I'm not going to pretend as though all we had to do was snap our fingers and millions of voters appeared out of nowhere. That's not how you build habits. But what we have found is that, sure enough, this cumulative impact of not just talking to these voters every 2 years, but talking to them whenever they have an election, is having some pretty significant results. And I'll give you some examples. We launched in 2017 in 6 states. And we track our success over a bunch of different metrics. Usually they're election specific. But what we care most about is long-term growth. And we track something we call graduates, which is how many of these non-voting environmentalists whom we're targeting don't just vote in the big elections, but also vote in state and local elections. How many of them become essentially super voters? And after our first 3 years, so 2017, 2018, 2019, 253,000 of the non-voting environmentalists we've been targeting had become such consistent voters that they were voting in even these like rinky-dink little local elections, including, I might add, over 50,000 in the state of Pennsylvania, which, as you know, was a state that was decided by 44,000 votes in 2016. So turning 50,000 non-voting environmentalists into consistent super voters who even vote in, library trustee and dog catcher elections is something we're pretty darn proud of.
Yeah, and so how are you going about things in this election? You mentioned that you targeted 6 states in 2018. What's your tactic this time around?
Yeah, so in 2020, we're working in 12 states. And I want to be clear, we didn't pick those 12 states because of the presidential election. A good way to think of the Environmental Voter Project is we're not an election-winning organization. Rather, we are an electorate-changing organization. So what we do is we identify states where there are lots of non-voting environmentalists, and then we go in there, and whenever there's an election, big or small, we use it as a behavioral intervention opportunity to turn them into better voters. That being said, obviously the presidential election is a pretty good opportunity to turn non-voters into voters. And we're currently working in 12 states. One of them remains Pennsylvania. And we are targeting 2 million already registered to vote people who list climate or the environment as their number one priority, but they have never, ever, ever cast a ballot in their entire lives. Because by definition, if you're unlikely to vote in a presidential general election, that pretty much means you've never voted before. So these are all potential first-time voters that we're targeting.
Wow, so people who have registered but have never actually cast a ballot. Why don't we see many environmentalists not voting?
I think a lot of environmentalists, often for good reason, are fairly cynical about politics, and they're not convinced that their votes matter. They're not convinced that politicians care about what they care about.
This seems like a particularly challenging year, difficult year to vote because of coronavirus and all the absentee balloting that's going on. How are you addressing that in some way, especially with people who might already, for whatever reason, be interested in voting, but not have actually cast a ballot before?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And you're certainly right that there are aspects of voter turnout and aspects of voting that are more difficult because of the pandemic, but also because of the Postal Service getting kneecapped. Yet there are also some things that are easier. So first, let me talk about the things that are harder. One of the most effective ways to turn non-voters into voters, even with all of the newfangled technology that people have, remains knocking on someone's door and having a conversation with them. And that's just not something that we're comfortable doing in the middle of a pandemic, and most campaigns aren't comfortable doing it. And so that is, both from a campaign and nonprofit side, but also from a voter point of view, a really important aspect of voter turnout that's missing. A lot of voters rely on door-to-door canvassers to give them information to help them to vote. On the other hand, some things have gotten a lot easier. So for instance, in Pennsylvania back in 2016 and even in 2018, there was no voting by mail. Whereas now people can sign up to get ballots mailed to them. And that started even prior to coronavirus. And so that's something that actually makes voting so much easier. A second thing that makes voting easier is obviously many states have opened up voting by mail. Many states have expanded early voting hours. And so normally the window in which organizations were able to turn non-voters into voters was much smaller than it is now. And now, Election Day isn't a day. Election Day is like 6 weeks long in most states. And so you have this evergreen opportunity of sort of multiple communication channels and multiple logistical ways to communicate with voters and for them to vote. And ultimately, I think that means we're going to have record turnout this fall. I mean, I think more people are going to end up voting in 2020 than we've ever seen before in any presidential election because of these things.
Would you attribute that to the changes in the voting system or in the particular referendum that is before people in terms of the current president, and there's a lot of strong feelings there?
Both. There's no doubt that the logistics of voting have gotten, as I mentioned, a little bit harder, but also a little bit easier in some ways. And so that in and of itself is going to increase turnout. And we're already seeing that in sky high early voter turnout numbers. I mean, we're knocking on the door of 30 million people already having voted, which is just an insanely high number. But even before the pandemic, in the 2019 local and state elections, in the 2018 midterm elections, we were seeing sky-high turnout. And that clearly wasn't due to logistical issues. That was due to a much more politicized environment that we're living in. I mean, the 2018 midterm elections had the highest turnout rate of a midterm election going all the way back to 1914. I mean, 1914, when the war to end all wars had just broken out and people were pretty concerned with the political future of the earth. Like, that was the last time we saw midterm turnout that high. So, yeah, I think there's this perfect storm of hyper politicization. There obviously being so many important issues at play, and all of these new ways in which people can vote that are coming together at a moment in time that's just going to send turnout through the roof, and we're already seeing that.
How do you get the information about people who prioritize environment and climate, those kinds of issues, in order to find them? And, it sounds like you're cross-referencing that information then with voter rolls, public information, voter rolls. But where do you get that first piece?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I want to be clear. What I'm about to describe isn't necessarily unique to our work. What I'm about to describe is also how the Biden and Trump campaigns now target voters, and a lot of sophisticated U.S. Senate campaigns. And what we all do now is we don't target people by demographic group. No one actually targets, soccer moms or NASCAR dads anymore. They target on the individual basis. And this is how campaigns do it. They start by surveying enormous numbers of people. Not your typical political poll of 600 or 800 or 1,000 people, but instead 15 or 20,000 people per state. And then what we do at the Environmental Voter Project is we isolate people who list climate or the environment as their top priority. And let's take the state of Pennsylvania as an example. Let's say we poll 20,000 people in Pennsylvania, and 4,000 of them come back and tell us that climate or some environmental issue is their top priority. Well, then it's the easiest thing in the world to work with data scientists to figure out, okay, what do we know about these 4,000 people who just told us that climate or the environment is their top priority? What data is there on the voter file about them? What census data do we have about them? What publicly available behavioral and consumer data do we have about them? Now, we only use publicly available data, and most organizations do that. There are obviously a few bad actors here and there, but we in political campaigns and almost everybody only uses publicly available data, magazine subscriptions that get sold and things like that. And what data scientists are then able to do is build this really rich picture. Okay, because of all this information we have about those 4,000 poll respondents, we think we can predict who all the other environmentalists are in Pennsylvania and actually assign them scores on the voter files that end up being like frighteningly accurate and figure out who all the other environmentalists are in the state of Pennsylvania. And it sounds like a very convoluted, complicated process, but a good analogy is actually the life insurance industry. If you've ever applied for life insurance, most people know the first thing you do is you say, oh, here's my medical history, here's my age, here's how much I drink, here's how much I smoke. And the insurance company builds an actuarial table and fits you into it that helps them predict how long you're going to live and what kind of policy they should sell to you. Well, we're essentially doing the same thing, but we're not trying to predict how long everybody in Pennsylvania is going to live. We're trying to predict how likely each person is to not only care about climate or the environment, but list it as their top priority. And these are frighteningly accurate. They're called predictive models.
So this is how, in part, I imagine my Facebook feed or Instagram feed have ads that are so targeted to my interests.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And what this allows us to do at the Environmental Voter Project is, again, bypass the hardest, most expensive part of politics, which is trying to persuade people to change their minds or educate them on issues. Oh my gosh, it's hard to turn a climate denier into someone who cares about climate change. We can just isolate the people who are already with us, the people who care so deeply about these issues that if you shake them awake at night, they're going to scream climate change. They're just not voting. And that allows us to just talk about to just deliver them messages, to text them and call them and mail them and send them digital ads based around the messages that will nudge them into becoming better voters. And that's a really extraordinary opportunity, because I won't claim that's easy. Changing behavior is not easy, but it's a heck of a lot easier and cheaper than changing minds.
Are you finding fewer and fewer of those people this year? Are people who say they care about climate and environment becoming more likely to vote because we have such a polarizing situation where you have one candidate, Donald Trump, a lot of the time calling climate change a hoax, and on the other hand, you have a candidate who is trying to come up with ways to move a clean energy future forward along with the economy?
There are certainly more environmentalists who are likely to vote this year than there have ever been before, but there are also more environmentalists that are unlikely to vote that we've ever seen before. And so both populations are growing for a good reason, simply because there are lots more Americans who care deeply about climate or the environment. But just to give you some very big sort of approximate numbers, we think, based off of our own polling data and also polling data that we've seen elsewhere, NPR Marist just came out with a great poll maybe about 3 or 4 weeks ago. We think there are about 30 million registered voters in the United States who care so deeply about climate or the environment that it is their number one priority. About 18 million of them are likely to vote in this presidential election, so about 60%. So that means there are 12 million already registered, mind you, unlikely to vote environmentalists out there. And that is an enormous latent pool of political power. I mean, that is just a huge, huge opportunity. I mean, people talk about the power of the NRA, for example. The NRA has 5 million members. 5 million members. And there are 12 million unlikely to vote already registered environmentalists out there. And so this is a huge, huge opportunity for the climate movement and the environmental movement, not just going into the 2020 presidential election, but going into 2022 and 2024 and municipal elections and county elections. We have such an enormous amount of latent political power. And if we can just tap into a little bit of it, oh man, we're going to be able to change everything.
Yeah. So when it comes to this, if we're looking right now at this election, you mentioned that the Environmental Voter Project is focused in 12 states, which is significantly higher number than in the 2018 election. So you're obviously growing. How are you choosing? Are these swing states, or how are you deciding which states to focus on?
So some of them are swing states. In fact, many of them are, but we didn't choose them because of that fact. So very quickly, our 12 states are Colorado, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine. And so some of them, Pennsylvania, Florida, Arizona, North Carolina, definitely battleground states. Others, Massachusetts, New Mexico, maybe less so. We choose these states because what each of them have in common is enormous populations of non-voting environmentalists. And that, more than anything, is important to us. We need those big fat denominators. We need big target populations. Because if we go into a state, no matter how politically important it is, and there aren't that many non-voting environmentalists there, well, it doesn't matter how good we are at turning non-voters into voters because it's not going to impact policymaking. So that's always our first criteria. And then our second thing that we always bear in mind is we're not just trying to change federal policymaking, we're also trying to change state and local policymaking. We're always using every election as an opportunity to turn these non-voters into voters because environmental policymaking is important at every level. And so what each of these 12 states also have in common is an enormous amount of room to grow on local and state environmental policymaking.
And we talked about this a little at the beginning of our conversation, but the trend looks like more and more people are listing climate and environment as important issues to them. Why do you think that's happening? What's happening with the American public that's growing?
I think two things are happening. First, for at least a generation, maybe more, the environmental movement has viewed environmental impact or environmental activism in a largely apolitical way. So for decades, if you were an environmentalist, you expressed yourself by changing how you get to work, or changing how you eat, or changing the electricity you consume, or recycling, or cleaning up stuff, all of which are very impactful, but none of which are political. Whereas if you care about another issue like immigration or public schools or gun rights or reproductive rights, you view that as inherently political. So there was this disconnect. And I think part of the reason we're seeing this growth in environmental political activism is because that is starting to change. And a lot of that, let's be totally honest, has to do with Donald Trump. He has politicized, regardless of whether you're red or blue or conservative or liberal. I think it is objectively true that he has making a lot of environmental issues more political than they were before. And that gets to the second thing that we're seeing. There is a very real, measurable phenomenon that political scientists always measure called negative partisanship, which is if people see something they don't like in the political sphere, that can motivate them just as much as being excited about something. And there's a lot of negative partisanship right now around every issue, but certainly around the environmental in the environmental communities, and that's bringing people off the sidelines.
Meaning, they see someone calling science, what seems to be pretty agreed upon science, to say the least, a hoax, and calling it into question again and again. Is that what you're talking about when you say that there's negative partisanship around it? What are you specifically referring to there?
Yeah, it can not just be around issues, although I think that's certainly one. It can also be around people and candidates, and I don't just mean the president, also sort of down ballot and things like that. We often like to say in a very high-minded way, people want something to vote for. Well, sort of. Many of them do, but a lot of people also vote because they want to vote against something. And that's what political scientists mean about negative partisanship. There are a lot of people who get riled up because they want to vote against something. And when so much changes and when so much policy changes, there are a lot of people on both sides of the aisle who say, I'm not looking at those people, and I there's nothing I want to vote for, but oh my gosh, that makes me angry, and that makes me angry too, and I want to vote against that. And so we're seeing a lot of negative partisanship. And that doesn't mean negative politics. It's more that there are a lot of people who are not just being motivated to vote for something, but they're being motivated to vote against something.
You know, what I thought you might say when I asked why more people were concerned about climate and the environment was that more people are experiencing the impacts of climate change with wildfires, with sea level rise, all kinds of storms, all these kinds of things that had been predicted are really starting to affect more people. So I thought that might have been something, but sounds like maybe those aren't the major reasons people are becoming concerned about these issues.
Well, no, I think that you're absolutely right that is also a major reason. I think that is not necessarily a reason that non-voters are turning into voters, but it's absolutely a reason that we're seeing people who cared about climate or other environmental issues now view it as a top priority. And there's a lot of research to back this up. Pew has done, again, more research in the not so distant past that has shown, for obvious reasons, that yes, people who have either experienced the impacts of the climate crisis or think they are likely to experience the impacts of the climate crisis are, surprise, surprise, more likely to list it as one of their top priorities. And what that also leads to is something that not many people recognize about the face of the modern environmental movement. When we talk about environmentalists, when we talk about people who list climate or the environment as their top priority, it is no longer white suburban yuppies viewing it as a luxury issue, that everything in their life is going so wonderfully that they have the luxury to care about environmental issues. People thought that was the case 20 or 30 years ago. I don't know if that was true. It certainly isn't the case now. When you look, both in our research and other people's research, at who these super environmentalists are, these people who list climate or the environment as their top priority, they are far more likely to be black or Latino than white. They are far more likely to make less than $50,000 a year than more. And they're more likely to be young rather than old. And so it's really, I think, important to understand that the typical stereotypes of the environmental movement really don't hold true anymore.
Do we know why that is? Why why people in these groups are more likely to care about environmental issues?
Yeah, it's because systemic racism subsidizes the fossil fuel industry. I mean, if you think about any fossil fuel, coal, natural gas, oil, toxic air and toxic water is a necessary byproduct of every part of the chain, right? So if you are extracting it from the ground, it creates toxins. When you transport it, it creates toxins. When you refine it, it creates toxins. When you burn it, it creates toxins. And we, as a systemically racist society, have decided, that's okay. We can live with all that pollution. We can live with all that toxic air and toxic water as long as we don't all need to experience it equally. We can live with it if it is in poor communities, in communities of color. And that systemic racism absolutely subsidizes the fossil fuel economy. If we cited coal-burning power plants in white suburbs, we would have shut them down 20 years ago. And so, yeah, it's no surprise to me why poor people and people of color are more likely to care deeply about environmental issues and climate change. They're the ones who have to deal with the impacts. We don't have to deal with them. People where I live don't have to deal with them. And I think it's so important that we understand this. It is no surprise at all why people of color have now come to the vanguard of the environmental movement, because we've dumped all this pollution on their backs.
So here I've been kind of assuming climate, you mean we hear the most about climate change as the most important issue, but what are some of the other environmental issues that you see listed as important to people who list environmental issues as important to them?
So certainly the climate crisis is one of them. And the climate crisis also tends to impact poorer people more than wealthy people, people of color more than white people. But clean air, clean water. So these are absolutely things that people are listing as top priorities to them. And again, in communities of color, you see much higher asthma rates. I don't want to get sort of emotional here, but like anybody who has seen a child suffering an asthma attack, I mean, it's one of the more frightening things when there is a very clear causal relationship between the coal-fired power plant belching toxins into the air in your community and your kid having these asthma attacks. Yeah, you're darn right you start caring about these issues.
Yeah, almost as you're talking about it, it's interesting. I can almost hear President Trump's response in the first presidential debate this year when asked about climate change. And he says, and he has said this on the campaign trail as well, crystal clear air, crystal clear water.
And something I want to make clear to the media, we have among the cleanest and sharpest, crystal clean, you've heard me say it, I went crystal clean, air and water anywhere on earth.
And it's surprising, he even says himself, who would have thought I'm going to be the environmentalist?
I am truly an environmentalist. But you have to understand, when we do things and they don't, and we clean, and it's very expensive to do that, and they don't, and we have this massive planet, and China, India, Russia, Germany, all these places, it's fuming up, and we're doing our job and beautiful. No, they have to do it also. Otherwise, it just doesn't work the way it's supposed to.
As you said already, this is a president who's rolled back many environmental regulations, has reduced the size of the national monuments, has done all kinds of things that people would consider to be anti-science, sort of on the other side of what's best for the environment.
What about the knives and the spoons that are plastic? Oh, they're okay, but the straws we got to ban. Has anybody ever tried? Seriously, the new straw, it's made out of paper, right? It disintegrates as you drink it. If you have a nice tie like this tie, this would have no chance. By the time you get finished, the straw is totally disintegrated. Does anybody walk around with a plastic straw? Because it's not bad. You whip it out, boom, boom.
What's happening?
Yeah, what's happening is he wants to win an election. And this is a proof point of our discussion about polling. He was not saying that stuff in 2016. Nor, might I add, was Hillary Clinton. Not because she wasn't an environmentalist. It's just that it's very hard for a politician to spend their time and energy talking about a set of issues that voters don't care about. But now, you're darn right, Donald Trump wants to win the state of Florida. And so he got an Air Force One, swooped down there, and announced that he was putting a moratorium on his own expansion of offshore drilling in Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. Because, love him or hate him, everybody who has to admit that Donald Trump is pretty darn good at reading polls. It's one of the few things he does with consistency every day of his life. He loves reading polls. And it is very clear that there is a huge, huge population of environmental voters in Florida. And am I claiming that Donald Trump's going to win a majority of them? No. But it's very clear that he's changing his rhetoric because he realizes that this is now such an important issue that he needs to start talking about it. Now, that doesn't mean that you should think he is believable, but I think it really is a proof point of the growing power of the climate movement and the environmental movement. And by the way, we can see the same thing from Joe Biden as well. Joe Biden obviously has very, very different stances on climate change and environmental issues, but we missed something really unique happening after the Democratic primary, which was that we saw a nominee tack left, not tack to the center, but tack left on climate. You don't do that unless you think, oh, this is a great way to get more votes and win an election. And so what we're seeing here gets down to one of the most basic premises of democratic elections, which is politicians have to go where the votes are. It's the basic arithmetic of how democracy works. Either you go where the votes are, or you don't get to be a politician anymore. And when we're seeing dramatically larger numbers of environmental voters, yeah, surprise, surprise, politicians are going to trip over themselves trying to appeal to them.
Sounds like what you're describing as 2020 is largely a year of the environmental climate change voter.
It's certainly getting that way. As we discussed, there are 6 times as many registered voters now listing climate or the environment as their top priority than there was just 4 years ago. And it's not like that's because of a blip. This is a consistent amount of growth. I mean, let's take Florida, for example. There are 2.5 million registered voters who we think list climate or the environment as their top priority in Florida, approximately 16% of the electorate in Florida. So actually in line with a lot of those national polls that we said have 12 or 14% of Americans listing it as a top priority. It's just a little bit higher in Florida. There isn't a single statewide election in Florida that is decided by like less than 30,000 votes. And there are 2.5 million super environmentalists there. 2020 could absolutely be the year of the climate voter.
Okay, well, Nathaniel, thank you so much.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Nathaniel Stinnett is founder of the Environmental Voter Project. Thanks for listening to Trump on Earth. If you like our show, please consider supporting us through Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/TrumpOnEarth. You can find us online at trumponearth.org and anywhere you get your podcasts. Write us a review and tell your friends. The podcast is supported by the Robert F. Schuman Foundation. Our producer and digital editor is Andy Cubis. Kathy Nauer is the executive producer. I'm Julie Grant.